committee, starting with the external examiner, Dr. Nadia Naffi from the University of Toronto, and then Dr. Andre Gagne from theology. He's external to the department, and the supervisory committee, Dr. Ayaz Nassim, and Dr. Saul Carliner, and the principal supervisor, Dr. Anne-Louise Davidson. So, this is a formality. So, is there any reason for us to have an in-camera session?
No.
No? Okay, so then we can proceed with the defense. So, you have, Nadia, about 30 to 40 minutes to present the highlights of your thesis. And when you're ready, you can begin.
Okay, so this is it. First of all, thank you all for being here, seriously, and thank you for the examining committee. I'm just going to start my timer so I can follow this. Canadians are divided. We are divided between people who believe less Islam brings less terror, no Islam, no terror, and people who stand with Muslims. And not only are we divided, we're also aggressive towards each other. Or at least this is one interpretation of the pictures that were shared online after the adoption of the motion against Islamophobia in March 2017. This other picture was taken during the far-right protest in Quebec last month, and while many would see freedom of speech, they would see maybe snowball fighting, what I see is my Lebanese civil war. I see weapons, and this worries me. This worries me as an immigrant, this worries me as a Muslim, this worries me as a mother, and it worries me as a researcher. And this worry started long before, it started in 2009, but my focus on the propaganda against refugees really started after Paris attack, when I was following the online interactions, the aggressive online interactions between the people who supported, the Canadians who supported the arrival of refugees, and those who were against it. And this is where I started this, this project. Many events followed Paris attack, including the election of Trump. And all these events led to a high level of online reactions against Muslims and refugees. And whatever was happening in Europe, in the US, and in some areas here in Canada was lived vicariously by many Canadians through social media. And suddenly, Muslim refugees became terrorist terrorists. And we all know that after 9/11, Muslims became terrorists, and now we're adding this to the mix, to the package. So now we're rapists too. And the famous hashtag refugees and the slogan "refugees not welcome" were trending online and offline. Another attack on Muslim was through this sign that was shared, installed next to Beauvilliers metro station here in Montreal. So I would have never imagined that this could happen in Canada, in Quebec, here in Montreal. And this sign was removed by the police and then reinstalled because it did not meet the criminal definition of hate speech. Many Canadian youth reacted to this attack against Muslims and Syrian refugees. So in the first picture, we see Matt, Amar, and Thomas, and they had a fourth friend behind the camera. They stood a whole day in one of Montreal's metro stations to confirm to the world that Muslims and non-Muslims were united here in Canada. Their pictures and their videos went viral. In the second set of pictures, we see youth volunteers in one of the welcoming centers, and they also shared their pictures through social media holding the hashtag #WeAreOne and Mussamini as a react to the attack on the Syrian refugees. And the last set of pictures were taken during the vigils that happened after the Quebec shooting, and these vigils were mostly initiated by youth, by Canadian youth. And these Canadian youth were asking to, their plan was to make racist afraid again. However, research on youth and on social media claims that youth are victims. They are easily manipulated by the plethora of messages shared online. And the perfect example is Alexandre Bissonnette, who shot 6 Muslims in a Quebec mosque last January, and it was mostly because he was a fan of Le Pen and Trump. Research also talks about how our youth are more of power users than powerful users, so they are more of a passive bystander. So substantial portions of youth are far less likely than others to have voice and influence. They are reluctant to share their perspective online. Which led me to my research questions. What I wanted to understand was a first-hand, I wanted to get a first-hand understanding of how Canadian youth construe the online interactions about the Syrian refugee crisis, how they construe their role in the integration and the inclusion of refugees in a context where the image of refugees was deeply influenced by social media. I also wanted to identify the knowledge and the skills that they would develop if we engage them in analyzing their thoughts and their behaviors in regards to a very sensitive and controversial issue such as the refugee crisis, and how could this knowledge and these skills facilitate their engagement on civil online reasoning and participatory politics. To understand the problem, I had to look at serious variety and of bodies of literature, including human performance technology and system theory. Since when I started, I was looking at the problem from a systems perspective. I also tried to find how the literature defined integration, exclusion, inclusion, what were the concepts and the theories attached to immigration, space, transnationalism, etc. So what I tried to do was to connect the dots between the different fields that were trying to understand, analyze the issue, and try to find a solution to the issue. So I spent some serious time reading some of the great work of these great minds. I know that you read my thesis, so I'm not going to go over all the concepts and the theories that I used in my manuscripts. However, I need to stop for a minute on integration and inclusion because these are really core to my work. When we talk about integration and inclusion, we need to visualize, or we need to think about two distinct processes. And these processes are performed by two distinct groups. However, integration and inclusion are interdependent. As a refugee, I can never, or it would be extremely difficult for me to integrate an environment that I believe hates me or prefers that I stay in a war zone and die burned by chemical weapons. And as a Canadian, it would be, again, super challenging for me to include someone. I believe that they will come with all their culture and religion and they want to enforce their beliefs on me and change my life. This will not happen, right? So in order for us to reach the society that we're dreaming reaching, we need to have this work with both groups, and we need to have this negotiation, and we need to have this, we need to focus on both processes and the two groups. As one of Concordia's public scholars, for the last year I was invited to speak about my research in several occasions, and in every time someone approached me, they asked me to speak about my research on refugees. And every single time I have to explain, I do not do research on refugees. I have no expertise in refugee studies. What I do is really focusing on the Canadian youth, the whole society youth. And this could be easily explained by the fact that most of our efforts are invested in trying to make these newcomers, these refugees, integrate. And less and less and less is done to work in our society to make it more inclusive, and even less is being done with our Canadian youth who are at the front line, like welcoming all these newcomers. And this is why I worked with Canadian youth. So I met 22 Canadian youth between 18 and 24 years old. They were coming from living in Quebec or in Ontario. 10 of them had never ever met a non-white person before they actually started their university. They identified themselves as male, female, and one agender. 6 of them were Muslims. They were all active on social media, so most of them followed the news there on their newsfeed. 5 of them had contact with refugees, so the other they didn't have a direct contact, however, they knew someone who had contact. So they knew someone who knew a refugee or even Muslims. And one of these 5 was actually, she was leading one of the welcoming centers. However, 21 of them decided that they were online passive bystanders by choice. It was their choice not to share their perspective online, and this was in line with the literature, despite the fact that they stood with refugees and with Muslims. So, of course, I needed to understand why. I chose Kelly's personal construct psychology as my theoretical framework, personal as per Kelly's basic philosophy that says that everything around us could be construed in so many different ways, and every single one of us goes through our experiences, people around us, problems in a very unique way, and we construct our knowledge. We are not passive receiver of or recorders of the information. We're actually constructing what we assume to be our reality. And per the fundamental postulate, a person's processes are psychologically channelized by the way he, she, or they anticipate events. Kelly says that our processes, our thoughts, behaviors, emotions are dependent on our predictions of the future. And these predictions are based on our construct system. And this construct system could be revised. So based on Kelly's constructive alternativism, we are not victims of our past or our biography. We can go back and revise and change. Now, change in so many contexts and situations is extremely difficult, emotionally challenging. However, it's never impossible according to Kelly, and which actually gives me hope when it comes to divides such as the divide between right-wing extremists and Muslim refugees, let's say. Kelly also explains through his sociality correlate that in order for me to engage with a constructive personal, constructive relationship with another person, I do not need to construe things the same way as this other person. What I have to do is to construe the construct system. So in other words, I need to be open-minded to try to understand how this other person thinks and why they think the way they think. And if I want to engage with multiple individuals at the same time, not only I should construe the construct system, I also need to construe the relationships between the members of the group or even between groups as per Proctor's relationality correlate. So, from PCP, I chose to use 4 methods with my participants. With the first method, so Kelly's self-characterization technique, I asked my participants to write a character sketch about themselves, about their stance in regards to the refugee crisis, and to describe their online behavior. Proctor's perceiver element grid was really a very interesting tool because through the tag, the participants were able to reflect on how they construed online posts, but also how other groups in our society construed online posts and how this construed could have an influence on the offline behaviors. Then we went and we dug even deeper, and we went to elucidate the constructs that the participants used in the context of the refugee crisis online and the propaganda against them. And then from these constructs, they chose one that was very important to them according to their choice. and we laddered it. So we went into more abstraction, and we arrived to the subordinate construct. In addition to these four methods, I engaged my youth in a reflection on the behavior, the strategies that they would use if they were to engage in countering the propaganda against Muslims and refugees. So after more than 100 hours of in-depth interviews with these amazing youth, and I say amazing because the 22 were extremely engaged, and they were extremely I asked them for 4 hours. They gave me 6, sometimes 7 hours. So they were really there, and they were super excited to participate. So I'm going to share with you, in a nutshell, the answers to my research questions. According to youth, to the participants, to the 22 participants, Syrian refugees are dehumanized by social media. They are considered as problem, as future burden. They ruined their country, and now they're coming to ruin ours. As for their role, and this was really very interesting, the fact that during the first interview, they talked about their offline roles. So they talked about if they were to help or to engage in helping the integration, the inclusion of refugees, they would have this offline roles with refugees in welcoming centers, on campus, in classrooms. By the end of our fourth interview, they started talking about offline and online roles with both refugees and members from their network and the whole society. So they started talking about disrupting the discourses around Syrian refugees, of counterbalancing the massive dissemination of hate posts. They felt that it was their responsibility to report posts that were offensive or contained lies or misinformation. They also talked about their role was to give another side of the story that was shared online, to help people who were reading these stories to have a more informed decision. They also realized that after each of the terror attacks, we had an immediate attack against Muslims and refugees. And they had to be there so they can counterbalance this attack. And they also discussed or talked about or realized that they had their biases, and in order for them to engage in a dialogue with other members of the network, they had to acknowledge these biases. My participants also developed knowledge and skills during our interviews. At the beginning, most of them discussed or talked, because they talk about this in schools, they talked about algorithm. So they were aware that whatever they popped up on their feed, it was really controlled by algorithm. But then, as they were reflecting on their own behavior, they realized that, okay, so we also had a set of criteria that we used to select what we wanted to click on, to read, or to just dismiss. They also realized that they were adopting the same behavior that they were accusing other members of our society of doing. So they were labeling the others as racist, as ignorant, as etc., judging them without trying to understand them. And as, again, they were reflecting on the posts, they realized that maybe these other groups in our society, maybe they have some legitimate concerns that we need to address instead of just judging. Maybe their attitudes are coming from the fact that they were living in small towns, so they didn't have any contact with others, maybe because they were influenced by social media, the education was not enough, like whatever, if there was a gap in the knowledge that they developed there, maybe they had this family and peer pressure that were forcing them to adopt or to have this discourse. So they started thinking about why the others were thinking the way they were thinking. Their decision to not participate in the discussions about the Syrian refugee crisis was a very conscious decision. But as they started working and reflecting on why, they realized that they had very clear perceived online barriers, and that they could actually overcome these barriers. They also developed critical thinking, not about only the media, but also about behaviors online, their own behavior, their knowledge about the Syrian refugee crisis, and their own thinking. And they realized that their inaction was actually an action by itself. By the fact that they were silent online, just observing, they were contributing to the exclusion of Syrian refugees. So what? Great. They developed this knowledge. And okay, so the thing is that, and I'm going to explain this now. So we engage in this learning. So what we did was really, they were learning about themselves. So what happened is that they moved from having this unconscious filtering, they had no idea that they were filtering to an explained online behavior. So now they had more control. They reflected on, okay, so this is why we read these things. By selecting or by clicking on this content, we're actually dismissing other content. So we don't have any, we're not reading what's going on the other side, so we're missing things there. They went from self-interest to sense of social responsibility. At the beginning of the interviews, they were talking about every time I asked them something, they were answering as, I don't want to read negative posts because this makes me angry, this makes me sad. It was an I at the beginning. By the end of the interviews, they started talking about, okay, so this I needs to do something because this I is actually contributing to what we don't want to reach, right? The exclusion of refugees. So this I has a responsibility. So we need to start engaging. They went also from worthless voice. At the beginning, they thought, why even care? Why should we even invest our time? Because the people with whom we will be engaging are stubborn, they are ignorant, so it's like hitting a wall. By the end of the interview, they realized, okay, so these guys have a very capable voice, and we do also have a capable voice. So let's start believing in our voice that it could be capable, empowered, and influential. They realized that they were labeling. And now they became curious to understand how others are thinking and why they were thinking the way they were thinking. And they passed from offline interaction. They thought that their only role could be offline with refugees. And now they started talking about online and offline role with both refugees and their friends who disagree with them. So, by learning about themselves, by developing the knowledge that I was sharing before, I had 22 participants after the 4 or 6 hours who now explained their online behavior. They developed a sense of social responsibility. They started believing in their voice. They now ready to understand. They were curious to understand how others were thinking, and they started thinking about different roles, online, offline, with different members. So now they are more ready to engage in civic online reasoning and participatory politics. I use 4 techniques stemming from PCP. But in order for me to use these techniques, I had to immerse myself for 6 months in PCP to read about PCP. I had to understand where this person construct psychology is coming from, and what were the premises, and I worked on the techniques over and over again. I tested them, I tried them on myself, on my kids, I was really engaged in really understanding how we can work with these techniques. I even went to Italy and I validated these techniques with members from the George Kelly Society. I had these conversations with Harry Proctor, who invented the bag. So I had to go through this learning journey to be able to use these techniques. I detailed these techniques in my 3rd manuscript, so people can, or educators, social workers can go there. But we need to expect that in order for them to be able to use these techniques, they need to go through developing this knowledge too. This is why. Knowing that this could be challenging in so many ways, after finishing my 4 manuscripts, writing my introduction, and I proposed a model. And this model is really a proposal. This is the first draft of this model, and this model can evolve. But this model is based on the tools that I use, the questions, the experience that my participants went through. So what I proposed was the following. we can start with, or we should start, if you want to engage youth in trying to know themselves so they can become ready to engage, to confront social media propaganda, then we need to start by putting them in a situation where they ask themselves, what is my stance on the issue and why? So when we're talking about an issue that is targeted by social media propaganda, and we need to understand why, because it could be coming from their family, from their peers, from something they read, so they need to understand where their beliefs or their stance is coming from. Once they identify and they have a clear understanding of their stance, and we can always evaluate the answers, we move to describing or analyzing their current behavior online. So facing this propaganda, what are you doing now? How do you react to your network? How do you react to the propagandists, etc.? And every time you ask why, because we need to go into their real, what they believe that it's the reason why they're doing what they are doing. We identify, we analyze their current behavior. Now we can move to the ideal scenario where, in case they wanted to confront the social media propaganda, what are the actions that they can do? But in order for them to design these actions, they need first to identify the goals that they want to reach. They need also to identify the audiences they want to target, and they need to also identify the skills, the knowledge, the resources that they have in order for them to actually do the actions they are planning to do, and then they can design these actions. So we have the stance, we have a clear understanding of what you do now, this is what we want to do. Are we motivated enough to engage in this kind of propaganda? Because we can have all the decisions that we want, but because countering the propaganda is really, it's not an easy task to do. So, do I care? Do I care enough to engage in this counter propaganda? What are my catalysts? What are my inhibitors, etc., and why? And again, I have my stance, I have my online, my current behavior, this is my idea, I'm super motivated. However, maybe I'm not confident enough to be online, right? So I need to make sure that I'm confident enough to engage in all the plan that I designed. My research stopped there. So what I did with the participants, or what happened, was that my participants went from passive bystanders to youth who were ready to start acting, but who did not act. So, in order for my Canadian youth to be able to become agents of change, understanding oneself is one piece, but we also need to cover media literacy, which is, of course, in the literature. And when we talk about media literacy, we're not only talking about media literacy of fear. I need to protect myself, I need to protect, great. We need to protect ourselves, of course. But also we need to have this media literacy of empowerment. How can I use these social media tools to have an influential role and voice? We also need to cover propaganda awareness, and we also need to cover or address the disciplines that are related to the topic. Like, for instance, with the Syrian refugee crisis, many of the participants were asking, what is Islam? How is Islam interpreted? Why we have this ISIS problem, etc. So we need to also address all of the other disciplines that should be included, and then we can move to action. And by acting, I mean civic online reasoning, participatory politics, and other. This is another process that I did not cover, but we should be working on, and then every act should be evaluated, and then from the evaluation we can go back to the knowledge if there's something missing, or again reflecting on ourselves, or the act by itself if it needs to be modified. Future direction. So in addition to working on this, the addition things, I would be like, this is one of the hopes that I would like to do is, first of all, the 22 youth who now are at the ready stage, it would be great if I could follow the 22 youth through an ethnography study to see whether they would start actually acting. Moving youth from ready to active, as I was explaining in the previous slide. I collected data from 20 youth from the European and Middle Eastern countries that I did not analyze yet. So my step after this is to analyze this data and compare it with the data that I collected from the 22 youth here in Canada and see whether I can identify potential transferable solutions. It would be super interesting to interview youth from the Against camp, authors of hate speech. Using the tag with both right-wing extremists and Muslim refugees to initiate dialogue and examine changes of attitude is something that I can't guarantee things, but I anticipate that it could lead to something interesting. The model and the 4 instruments that I used to shed light on very specific group. However, these tools could be used to shed light on the influence of social media, on the inclusion of other groups that are targeted in our society by hate discourses. And we need to move from theory to practice. We have the tools. I'm proposing a model. However, I can't assume, or I can't even claim that we can ask tomorrow our educators and social workers and parents who are at the front line to start using these tools without being trained. Talking about this topic is very sensitive. It's very challenging to many educators and social workers and even with parents, and we need to prepare training for them to be able to engage in this. So, I mean, a single youth can do amazing things. A group of youth can do amazing things. If we become a society of agents of change and of dialogue, we will hopefully collectively overpower hate